your wife have to work?
I might have been too.
No, she didn't work on, she was cleaning her travel
So are you
bag.
from-
She said,
Kind of neat.
She
Yeah.
doesn't have that historical love that I do.
I see.
Not, but my grandparents had property. So we spent a lot of time driving through Black Diamond.
Look at how
Mark,
I-
have you got my husband one of these pictures? This is
Yeah.
Glenn Reeves.
It's not.
Mark Reeves, he's
Yeah.
on the board of the Historical
I
Society.
was
How-
Jeanette Cobbles.
Okay.
What's her name again?
I have been, but
Glenn,
not anymore.
Glenn Ford,
No,
but it's Glenn
I
Reeves.
was on the secretary here for 12 years,
Before you leave
And
today,
I
see me because I'm
decided
looking
it's
for a
time
quilt that somebody
move on.
donated here.
but I still go
This
through
beard?
once in a while.
We can't find it anywhere in this building. It was donated years and years ago. It supposedly has the name, it was made out of men's ties, and it's got the wording Carbonado on it.
That's pretty cool.
I know.
Get
So
down
we
there.
don't know, we have looked everywhere for it.
This is,
Okay,
you
so
know,
we might have it?
I talked to Foothills, and they don't have it, but they're looking to see if anybody from Wilkeson has it.
Okay.
And then I thought, well, why not just keep looking around, right?
Okay.
Let me know.
I like.
I
It
will.
might have been loaned for something, who knows, right? It was actually the wives of Ravensdale miners that made it, but for some reason it's got the Carbonado on it.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Zach.
One of the husbands working there.
That's what, yeah, who knows, right? I mean, all around there's like
Yeah,
one
he's
big
volunteer.
town.
It kinda is.
Exactly.
This one's always good. Yeah, it's different from the other one.
Are you ready?
No. You're gonna make me do it anyway.
Yeah.
Okay.
Water.
I got my jug of hose water.
When I retired.
Wow.
If you pull that down.
Yeah.
Doesn't vibrate.
Go ahead.
You got it.
When I retired from the company, that's when I
You're the one
joined
pressuring.
the-
And actually, in reality, the one pressuring is Greg.
That's good. All right, you ready?
Greg is the
Well,
one
I ended up
pressuring.
being a secretary.
Hey, everybody, welcome to the museum here at Black Diamond. We're excited to have so many people here for another one of Zach's great presentations. So
Last one of
many of you know
2025.
him. Yeah, this will be the last one of 2024. He's
Yeah, I'm
got a
already
whole
thinking of
whole slate of
2025.
stuff coming for 2025. But today we'll be talking about the floods of the valley. And we're awful proud of Zach. He was selected recently to present at an Indigenous symposium. And I spoke with one of the people who helped put it all together, and she was telling me how fantastic he was. So we're really proud to have him here, and he donates all of his time and energies to put these together, and of course does them all for free for us. So I know you will enjoy. So I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Zach Pratt. Thank you very much.
Well, again, they'll enjoy because they have free cookies and drinks. That's the real part.
That's the only reason I come.
Exactly. See, you say that, Greg. but
What's
we
that
don't.
guy's name?
Exactly. What am I
If
doing
you
here?
need to get up and get a cookie and a water, it's okay. If you want a water, raise your hand.
That's why they're there. Well, good morning, or afternoon, or evening, depends on where you're coming from. Or also, we're live on YouTube, so if there's people watching this across the world. The last live stream that we did, we actually had people from the East Coast all the way to Australia watching our presentation. So our little museum here in the southeast King County is starting to extend out to the world again. I'm sure we all know at one point in time our coal extended out to the world, but now our reach is growing once again. So thank you everybody on YouTube who watched that eventually, and thank you guys for coming again. And as Sherry said, this is the last presentation of 2024. It has been a crazy year, a very crazy year. Which is ironic using the crazy term because we're going to talk about floods today, which is a very crazy geologic thing to actually happen. Hydrology is not really my background. My background is more of kind of the geochronology and actually geophysics, which is funny because I'm not good at math. I don't know how I ended up with a physics degree, but hey, here we are. And we're also, this is something Sherry and I are working, but we're starting here at the museum to start working on recognizing our stewards, original stewards of the land. In this case, we know them as the Muckleshoot, but there were two specific bands of people from the Muckleshoot that resided in this area. Don't ask me to pronounce the names because I don't know Coastal Salish and Lushootseed, but those are our two groups of folks that were in this area in general. And of course, we thank them for being the original stewards of the land. However, I bring them up because they are an early part of this story. We know the forests of Black Diamond and the area around here, of course. We know that great hunting out here, wonderful fishing. I was driving up through Auburn this morning, and there's tons of guys that are down on the river fishing at this time of the year, which par for the course. But these folks here with the Muckleshoot were originally out here for that same purpose. I mean, we had a fish camp down on Jones Lake. There was a longhouse that was over on Lake Sawyer. There's plenty of evidence of having them out here. There's also plenty of evidence on the other side of the river headed out towards Cumberland, the Beezy Valley, and all that stuff. And it was also used by a few other groups of people, additional Muckleshoot bands, as well as the Nisqually, Snoqualmie, Walla, Yakima used this area as kind of a cross-mountain transit back and forth. And it's funny because, well, we don't see that on a mass scale in this day and age. Even back in the day, it was noted. This is, if you came to my Stampede Pass presentation, this is a little excerpt from it from a gentleman by the name of Bogue. He was kind of the guy that originally charted Stampede Pass. And he mentions in it that on the southwest border of this wilderness lived the tribe of Muckleshoot Indian, but there were no white men except two settlers, George W. Vanderbeck and James Mitlock. Now, these two fellers were out on the Enumclaw Plateau, a little bit much further south than us, but they were kind of the last vestige of white civilization before you hit nothing. But after that, the Indians had stories of some of their numbers once crossing the jungle described, reaching Mount Enumclaw, a great cliff at the base of the foothills, but beyond that point, no living Indian had ever penetrated. There was, however, a tradition of a trip made by one of their ancestors to the headwaters of the Green River, where he found pleasant country and good fishing. Now, at least from my perspective, we still have pleasant country and good fishing out here. That's just me. But I find this incredibly interesting, especially that last part there where it says, beyond that point, no living Indian had ever penetrated. When we look up at that area today, it's ironic because hikers and recreationalists can't penetrate that area because of different land issues that we'll get into there eventually. But what that tells me is that area is a very wild, very secluded, and very hard to get to area. So what's interesting too about that is that, and we'll get into this a little bit more too, is that upon inspection a couple times up at the dam that we're going to be discussing, they have found multiple prehistoric sites up there, probably more that are even up, that have been buried by the reservoir that we're going to talk about a little bit. But it's just one more of those little steps of kind of why we have to acknowledge that they were here at least before us. So now this part that I get to bore you all with, the geology. How did we get here? How did we get to the point where some guy is sitting here talking to you about floods? If you've been to any of my presentation, you know that LiDAR is one of my favorite tools. If you don't know what LiDAR is scanning the ground, and it does a really good job at stripping away all the organic matter, the trees, the leaves that are on the ground this time of year, buildings, people, and showing us what the actual topography of the ground looks like. So this is a snapshot of this area, if you will, to give you kind of some idea of what's going on down here. We've got the city of Auburn right up here, confluence of the White River, Green River. And Green River heads up this way, White River comes down this way, off down towards Mount Rainier and Tahoma. Black Diamond right about there, Lawson Hill right about there, our lovely Green River Gorge, and the Howard A. Hanson Dam, which is what we're going to be talking about today. The reason I show you the geology first is to kind of get established the how. So we're gonna take this in a couple chunks here. We'll start down in Auburn, the confluence of the Green and the White River. When rivers come together, they create a lot of chaos because a lot of water flowing. It seems pretty simple, but the city of Auburn, pen's not working. City of Auburn being right there. I did this presentation, one, because it's interesting, but two, because I have a lot to thank for the Howard Hanson Dam, because my house is right there. Yeah. We'll get to a picture in a little bit later, and I'll point out to you where my house is, just to show you why I'm so thankful for the Howard Hanson Dam. So we're going to change it up, though, today, is we're going to use a little bit of 3D mapping to show it. This is something I've been monkeying around with lately. Now, ignore Mount Rainier, Tahoma. This is a relief map, so it distorts things a little bit when they go on grand scale like this, but we'd only have to focus on down here. So again, a little bit of where we're at. We've got SeaTac Airport, which is actually a lot bigger than you'd think. You don't really get that space when you're sitting in the terminal, bored and pissed off that you're at the airport, but seeing it from the sky, it's actually pretty impressive. But we got Tukwila, come down here, we've got Kent, Auburn up here, and then we can just see our little river channels that come out of here. Now, if we go back in time to our story, you'll notice that that's a lot of flat ground, and there's a lot of mountains that are going on up there. It's those darn glaciers again. It's always the glacier story in this area, paired with the volcano story, but it's those damn glaciers again. So that LiDAR imagery that I showed you a little bit earlier, here's what it looks like. It's kind of more of a 3D actual map. Again, my house right down in there, 2 rivers right there. That's dangerous, if you will. We got Enumclad over here, Black Diamond over there. Can't really see it. If you follow the Green River up here, you'll notice that those channels are starting to look more like what we would think of when we think of a river valley. And as we go up those valleys a little bit, we can kind of run up to the Green River Gorge a little bit. My precious. Thank you for being you, river that you are. Sorry, I'm getting a little off track there. But we see Black Diamond off there on the left-hand side. We see Lawson here. But we notice that from where Auburn is and then coming up the Green River Valley, we narrow really quickly. And we go through a 12-mile gorge really rapidly, from wide open plain to really quick. But interestingly enough, on the other side of the gorge, when you get out towards like Canasket-Palmer State Park, things flatten out a little bit, which is interesting. There's kind of a gap, if you will, between the gorge and Canasket itself. Those darn glaciers again. But we notice that where the river starts to go up back into the mountains, if you will, it starts to get narrow again. And more narrow. If you have looked at Google Maps at all, you may notice the Tacoma Water Purification Plant. I have a couple stories about Tacoma Water, which we'll discuss a little bit in a bit, but we ultimately end at the Howard Hanson Dam. That's not what the dam looks like. Again, we're dealing with distortion here, and that's not really something that I can affect, but as we were talking about it. But so this is kind of, we're going to talk to this point and then down, if you will. But there's one kind of thing that's interesting. Geology 101 tells us that an older river system will basically cut through narrow valleys and then slowly expand out kind of the sides. It eats at the side, creating those wide plains that we have. So the Green River Valley, as you're driving up from Auburn out to, say, Flaming Geyser State Park, old valley. It's been there a while because it's a wide plain. So why is the gorge, if the Green River has been going that way for so long, why is the gorge that the Green River flows through now one of those narrow kind of V-shaped valleys that indicates a younger river system? Well, we've again got our glaciers to blame. At one point in time, these are very, very well-colored maps by Microsoft Paint. Very well done. At one point in time, our Green River right here actually flowed north of Mount McDonald into a much wider open plain, and then met up with the Cedar River right about Selleck prior to flowing. It initially flowed a little bit further north along the base of Tiger Mountain, but it was kind of shoved southwards across the Covington Plateau to where Suits Creek is now because of those darn glaciers, and now it's in the path that it is. And we'll see a little bit on that 3D map, but again, this is what LiDAR is so great for. Because say like when you're driving from Covington north to Fairwood, and you're kind of going up and over all of those humps, every single one of those humps that you go down into, that's where the river was at one point in time. LiDAR does a great job of showing that. And it was kind of amazing because when you go up to some of those hillsides and you're digging on the side of them, you'd think you'd see normal dirt that you would see in the forest, but you're finding full-sized river cobbles from that time period. And it's kind of crazy to see. I have a friend that lives out in that area, and I stopped at her house one day, and I was just like, "You got a hill in your backyard. Can I go look at your hill?" I started digging at her hill, and she goes, "What are you doing?" Like, "I'm looking for river rock." She goes, "How are there river rock here?" And right when she said that, I pulled out one of those rounded river rocks that we would know, and I'm just like, "Look at it." And she's like, "I don't get it." I was like, "Okay, cool, whatever." So from the backside of Howard Hanson, we've got kind of an interesting thing going on here. So this is actually, if we go past Howard Hanson, which is right here, and we're looking back towards the west of it, the river currently goes down that channel down there to the left. And when I say it went north towards Selleck, we're talking this direction here. Well, that kind of looks no river, which is interesting. And especially, too, kind of talking a little bit more about that older river system, if you will. This is from Kelly Butte, which if you ever get the chance to go up to Kelly Butte on a hike, excellent. Great place to camp in that area. But interestingly enough, we're standing, we have a really good vantage point here because we can see a lot of the Cascades. Stampede Pass, which is the current route that the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad goes through. Okay, well, those are kind of wide valleys. Green River Valley isn't all that high, so there was no real glaciers that were in there. They've got that kind of big old valley shape that comes with an older river system, and it's especially apparent when you look downstream. So Lester, if you've ever been down there, is roughly right about there. But downstream too, again, we're not seeing that sharp V-shaped valley that we would normally see in regards to a younger river system. So that's interesting. That part of the river almost seems younger than what's going on, or older than what's going on at Howard Hanson. And when we look a little bit closer here, this is Selleck right here, which scares me because Selleck, the hills have eyes. So we notice the river up here, where the Green River is right up here, but again, here's that little bit more of a flat carved out valley, and then we've got the Cedar River right here. Well, you'll notice if we zoom in a little bit closer on those kind of separation points, there's a heightened point right here because of those darn glaciers coming in here and just continuously pushing material over and over and over in the last 2.4 million years. It's basically built up a plug on that north side. And during those ice ages, as the Green River was coming down, pushing material and so on and so forth, it eventually reached a point where it raised up so high in level that would actually take Eagle Gorge, which is what it's called now. We're talking in the form of, like, have you ever heard of the Missoula floods over out in eastern Washington? Of a similar kind of flood story in that regard, not as big, obviously, but water always tries to find the easiest way out. And when you continue to have material just pile up, pile up, pile up, pile up, Green River's got no choice but to start digging again. So it's because of that continual glacier story that we've now shoved it over into this much more narrow, if you will, gorge. Almost like a second gorge. It's kind of cool to think that we've got two gorges. The problem with that, though, is that the Green River comes from the Cascades, and just as it is right now here in Washington, it's raining. And it rains a lot. Like, a lot in this area. This is roughly Kent, or what would be Kent, under about 12 feet of water, roughly, in 1959. I believe Lynn in the back said, she mentioned looking and seeing floods like this down in Kent. So this is not something that's like in the past. This is like recent history. Like my grandparents were alive for this, which is crazy to think. And the fun part about this is getting to share some of these photos that don't necessarily, like, and if you've looked up these flood stuff, you've seen some of these photos before, but it's fun to actually like look at these photos because while folks like this, you know, they're farmers and they got pain to deal with these floods all the time, they still have fun with it. Now, as settlers began coming up the valleys and kind of trying to find places to live and whatnot, with a river flooding like this, it's very hard to establish residence in a valley like this. Incredibly hard. The river's going to do what the river's going to do, and you don't really got much of a choice in which way it goes or not. So what do? You build dams, or at least what looks like a dam. It looks like they just cut down some cedar trees and laid them on the side of the river, which I don't, you know, you see levees with that thumb sticking out there, but those are just straight trees laying there, so I don't know really what they were thinking in that regard. But this happened all over the valley for both the White River and the Green River. And it was just a matter of farmers trying to direct in which way the waters was going to go. And it got a little nasty sometimes between the folks of King County and Pierce County. In fact, it got really nasty most of the time because we would get instances where the valley would still flood, but the valley was flooding because of those farmers and them trying to direct that flow, if you will. This is a pretty well-known one about O'Brien, which is just a little bit south of Kent, if you will. But didn't matter. Those floods still happened. I mean, that's why I would say don't cut down trees and put them right next to the river because they just create a battering ram. And yeah, I'm no structural engineer, but just that doesn't seem like a good idea if you ask me. A couple more photos. This is a pretty well-known one. This is the interurban line. And just to show you how crazy those, when you think about railroads, how they're kind of built up on a platform with kind of slopes on the side of it, to think about that much water just coming through and just ripping that out like it's nothing. I'm not sure I would trust myself standing on that, but hey, there was a different breed back in the day. Now, where I live in downtown Auburn, little different vibe than what it is right now. There's a bunch of people that are, down there for the Veterans Day parade currently. But Auburn is interesting because Auburn's right at the confluence of both the White River and the Green River. In fact, just on the other side of this photo, there used to be a bridge through downtown Auburn. A bridge in the sense of full-scale bridge in downtown Auburn that actually had the river going right underneath of it. So I don't know who decided in Auburn to pick and choose where to build, if you will, but building right on top of a river. Now, to be fair, actually, now that I think about it, the city of Auburn used to be named Slaughter. So obviously we don't know how to pick names and we don't know how to build towns properly, either way. But of course, these floods still happen no matter what they did. I found a quote through the research on this process and it's from the Kent Historical Society, and it comes actually through a document that was done by the Skagit Valley Historical Society, where they mentioned that miners from Black Diamond were actually hired at certain times to go out into the Kent-Auburn Valley and blow up bluffs to help further redirect the river. I mean, I guess you gotta make extra money somehow, especially living in a town like this that was a company town, but again, I'm not sure how I would feel about being responsible for the directional of, destruction when it comes to the river. But eventually we start kind of getting to a point where it's like, okay, we have to start actually building this stuff and, make levees. This is the Auburn Game Farm Park, which if you've ever gone down there, you can still walk on top of this levee, which is crazy to think that it's still there, but it's still defending Auburn and Puyallup and Sumner. Pretty much everywhere that the White River touches in this day and age, this levee is still working to this day. Now, I promised to show you one of the reasons why I am so grateful for the Hanson Dam, and it's this photo right here. If you've ever been up to the cemetery, that when you're headed up towards Federal Way, it's on the west side of the valley, if you will. My house would be right about there. Right there. Under about 12 feet of water. So I'm very grateful for those dams and levees, if you will. But I mean, this stretch, you can see that whole valley floor that we looked at a little bit in those 3D images is just water. Water, 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 and more water. Now that goes back, we can go back a little bit further prior to the glacial story that we talked about in regards to how the directional shift of the actual river happened. That was more of along the lines of the Kent-Auburn Valley used to be as a whole an embayment of the Puget Sound. There was salt water all the way through it, but again, those glaciers and then Mount Rainier, Tahoma actually pushed material around here, but the Green River wasn't letting it go dry, if you will. There's one flood in particular that kind of kicked off everything, if you will, and that occurred in 1906. This was the kind of flood that is talked about forever. It's still talked about to this day, and it's really the reason kind of why the process of damming those rivers began. It was so catastrophic to the point that the White River and the Green River used to flow into at Auburn. The White River then flowed north up through Tukwila into the Duwamish area and all that stuff. That's the reason when you're driving in kind of Kent, you see those signs that say White River Drive and stuff like that, which I would think because the White River flows south, you would want to change the name now, but I'm not on the Kent Transportation Board, besides the point. But this flood was so crazy, and those farmers were so angry at each other from King and Pierce County about the flood being directed and whatnot, that they actually brought in a gentleman by the name of Hiram Chitnam, which we know as Chitnam Locks up in Seattle. And Chitnam's came down here and he looked around, kind of did his engineering surveys, and pretty much told everywhere that nature has transferred the course and it will be simpler and perpetuate it than change it again. So, what do you do at this point in time? Well, you start building some of those more permanent levees, such as Auburn Game Farm Park, but then you start building dams. It's a very simple solution, can hold back water and all that stuff. So we got Howard A. Hanson Dam. Now, you'll notice here, 1962 is when Howard Hanson opened, and that flood happened in 1906. Well, there's 2 world wars that happened during that time period, and getting federal fundings for projects like this is not easy. So there were 60 years of floods that occurred after that. And it's interesting too, because White River Dam was actually, Mud Mountain Dam was completed prior to Howard Hanson. It was completed in the 40s. But the photos of building this thing are just insane. I mean, this is kind of the penstock, or kind of what helps regulate the actual flow of it. The Eagle Gorge, which is where the dam itself is, I mean, we see this as this kind of narrow, again, that young river system that kind of goes down in a V shape. And as Howard Hanson began to kind of take a little bit more of a form, you know, bringing the actual level up, the interesting part is that the day that the dam was considered open, it stopped a flood. And it stopped a serious flood from that sense. But you'll notice that these photos are grainy, and there's not many of them, which is very, very strange. Well, one hand, it's because of the people that own the land, and two, Howard Hanson's in a pretty remote place. Selleck is already remote, it's the end of the road, but then to keep going past that, when you're going out towards Canasket and you go even further, it's pretty darn remote. Mud Mountain, on the other hand, up 410, that Cheese Pass, so on and so forth, a little easier to get to. And we have some good photos of Mud Mountain actually being constructed, if you will. And because Mud Mountain and the White River went through a very narrow channel, similar to where Eagle Gorge is, we can use photos from Mud Mountain as a replacement for what they were doing up at Howard Hanson. So these come from the Enumclaw Historical Society. Their situation is a little different because their geology is a little different about where they built the dam. But you can see kind of, one, this is a good place to build a river in both cases because the gorge is narrow, you don't have to build very wide, and you can build it pretty high in both cases. So these guys had a little bit of an interesting story because they had a lot of material to kind of blast to get down to bedrock in consideration for it. So they put these giant tarps up and then bucket down material and bucket it up and bucket down material and bucket up. In the case of Howard Hanson, it was a little easier because they could just truck everything out of there. But they were trucking it up and out. In fact, I believe, yeah, I was going to say, Sherry, your dad, I believe, was trucking up there. So dumping material and moving it and all that stuff. But, you know, Howard Hanson still had to use these giant water monitors. And sometimes I wonder if those water monitors were left over from when they did the Seattle regrade, because they handled it the same way. When in doubt, high pressure water, it's a hell of a thing. But eventually, as time went on, they were able to get down to that bedrock, release the river in stages, and then start building back up. They did have the one distinct advantage in the fact that they were out on Weyerhaeuser land, and so they could use the railroads. It must be nice, because we didn't have that option. We had trucks going out in that direction, because for Howard Hanson, they were also shifting the railroad at the same time. They had to shift a lot of railroad after that land was condemned. Mind you, we didn't have this problem, which I always look at photos like these and think to myself, did the engineer of that train get fired? Or was he reprimanded in any way? I mean, everything slid off, so this might not have been an accident for himself, but man, I can't imagine crashing a train back in the day was good for your career, if you will. But Mud Mountain is different from Howard Hanson in the sense that Mud Mountain is literally, they built the dam and there's a hole in it, which sounds counterintuitive to a dam, but it does this in such a way that this little hole down here that we see, that water, as it comes up, it's got that block point. It's kind of like when you put your foot on your drain in your bathtub and then you pull it off after the water kind of comes up and down. Same general thinking, if you will. So we can get water that stretches really high up, and it can get back almost to green water, which is quite far. There's a lot of water that can be held behind this dam. One interesting thing that I was reading through this process was that they're not sure if Mud Mountain can hold up if Mount Rainier has another eruption and there's a lahar that comes down it. So I would not be standing in the White River Valley personally as somebody that lives there, because if all that gets blocked up and then the mountain, yeah, that's a different presentation for a different time. But I did mention the Northern Pacific Railroad because they're a part of this story too. Their tracks run right next to the river that goes out there. If you've been to Leicester, you've seen the products of the trains moving up and down there. You kind of couldn't make it out from Kelly Butte, but at night up there, you can see the trains going up and down Stampede Pass. It's really cool to see. But their story is they got to get up to this pass, and then they got to get through it. So the thing about that is that they had to move almost 16 miles of rail to make way for that dam that was going to inundate those areas. What's so interesting about that is you would think that you throw all that rail out of the way and it's gone or whatnot. But there's still some evidence of that stuff out there. When they do drawdowns at the dam, one of the tunnels that they used to have to go through, you can still see those tunnels that kind of go through these points of land through this area, which in my head is just really fascinating. But at the same time, if you came to some of my earlier presentations, our good friend Virgil Bogue, you know, the mention of Stampede Pass always, but that's a joke that you had to come to previous presentations to kind of appreciate that one. So Howard Hanson Dam, who is Howard Hanson? Well, Howard Hanson is a gentleman that suffered from floods just as everybody else in the same area. He was state legislature in 1907, and really he witnessed those floods firsthand, especially in 1906. And from there, he was kind of the champion of saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't flood our houses every single year. We're not Florida. We don't need to deal with this. So from 1907, really through the rest of his life, he was the prime director when it came to all of this. And he really talked a lot to locals in regards to this and farmers and kind of saying like, hey, if we clear this area out, you won't have to deal with flooding. You won't have to deal with your neighbors trying to blow up your backyard, if you will. Now, again, through everything though, we do have 2 world wars that are in the way. So it kind of delays certain things here and there, but he's the one that kind of got that rubber stamp when it comes to the actual money that is required for this. Now, he didn't actually see the full construction as he passed away in 1957, but through an act of Congress, the folks that did end up building it named it after him. So here's we've got a couple modern photos in regards to what's going on up at Howard Hanson. So you can see the railroad and how they've had to basically shift it up and over the dam, if you will. We've got the structure of the dam coming along here. We've got that little narrow canyon that we were talked right there. I've got a good friend that's actually a conductor for Burlington Northern Santa Fe, and I'm jealous of the pictures that he takes when he's crossing that area as a whole. Every time he sends me a picture, I'm like, you son of a muffin. Besides the point. Howard Hanson's overall kind of schematics, if you will, this is kind of the dam engineer's perspective, if you will, is at its full height, probable maximum flood control, if you will, is roughly around 1,200 feet. The bottom of it is around 1,000 feet. So it's about a 200-foot tall dam, about 460 feet across. It's relatively small in the grand scheme of things. I mean, when we look at photos like this, you know, we see an excavator there on the left-hand side, that metaphorical hole in the side of it. So it's not a big dam, but because of that placement in that little narrow kind of V-shaped valley, it does its job very well. However, no story of Howard Hanson is complete without also mentioning Lester. Now, if you've ever gone out for a hike in Lester, Lester is a wonderful little area to go. It's very quiet, open country. The one time I've been out there, if I had a fly pole, I should have brought it with me because I've heard there's really good trout fishing out there. It's just a great place to go. Lester was the west side equivalent to what Easton is. They were stops for the railroad to kind of refuel, get water in them, and then grab extra engines to kind of help push the trains up and over Stampede Pass. Same thing occurred over in Easton. Lester also benefited a lot from the fact that there was forestry in the area, so on and so forth. But those steam engines were the kind of the big thing. And it's because steam, while powerful, yes, it's not as powerful as, say, diesel locomotives, which were coming down the track, if you will. So some of more kind of those logging areas. This is a town called Nagron, which is literally just Morgan spelled backwards, and it's named after the gentleman that actually built this town, if you will. Very original. It's actually a more original name than, say, Black Diamond, in my opinion, but, you know, we could do better. So why do I mention Lester and why do I mention this area? Well, you need a lot of land for a reservoir, and I do mean a lot of land. And the railroad understood this, and another little agency understood this, and that's Tacoma itself. Tacoma had started to buy a lot of the land in kind of that general area as a way to start getting water for their city. If you want to compete with somewhere like Seattle, you need water. So Tacoma, really around the start of the 1900s, had started to buy land subsequently out there and then close it off for water protection. Now, this especially started to get bad as time went on through World War I and World War II. They kept quietly buying these parcels of land And then when the U.S. Forest Service came out and said, hey, we're going to condemn this land, who wants it? You know, this is basically worthless land. Well, Tacoma raised their hand and said, we do, give it over here. So pair that with our diesel trains that were starting to come around at the time. This is a lovely bridge. This is kind of the last stop that you can go across before you head up there and the land is closed. What I find ironic about this engine, and I'm not sure if you can see it in the back, Burlington Northern Santa Fe owns that line that goes up and over. There's a Union Pacific engine right there, which I always see stuff like that. I'm like, how did that train get on that track? And what's the story there? Besides the point. But also with diesel engines, they have more direct power to their wheels, so you don't need multiple engines to connect up to them like you would with the steam locomotives. They also run more efficiently. They require less people to own and operate them, if you will. So at that point in time, Leicester didn't need an engine bay to be there, so they tore down the facilities that were there. And most of those folks that lived there, that worked on the railroads, then moved down to Auburn, where Burlington Northern Santa Fe had kind of started to do their thing down over there. In fact, my house was originally owned by a gentleman that worked at that railroad, and I still have these big railroad ties in there. I don't know what I'm going to do with them, so if anybody wants a railroad tie, please contact me afterwards. But Easton had a little bit different story than Leicester. Easton benefited because around the same time they were building I-90. Now, while a lot of little towns along the way out there died off because the railroad didn't go through, or the highways didn't go through them, Easton is just off of I-90. And while it's not big, it's still there. Leicester, on the other hand, didn't have anything to kind of back it up. In fact, Leicester was often considered one of the most isolated towns in all of, not just King County, but Western Washington, because it is so far out there. So Tacoma Power and Tacoma Water, being the agencies that they are, eventually got to the point where when that land was fully condemned, they were able to buy certain pieces of land that kind of stopped things, if you will. So residents of the Leicester were pissed off. They don't want to leave their homes. Why would you? It's a gorgeous area out there. It came to a head in the 1960s, and this is kind of where the story just goes all over the place, because people of Tacoma need water, but the people of Leicester want to live there. So there is a lot of back and forth. I'm skipping over a lot of personal social history here because this could be a presentation by itself. But kind of the big things to note here is Tacoma Power got the actual spot and the direct path up to Leicester. So they closed it. They put a gate right there, and the people of Leicester, their only option would have been to go back up and over to Stampede Pass, which is not convenient by any sleight of the hand. And during the wintertime, you're not getting your car up and over that. So this really came to a head when King County said, we own the road. We have rights to the road. You can't put a gate on our road. Get out of here, Pierce County. And Pierce County was just like, this is Tacoma's problem, not ours. And Tacoma was like, come at us. So King County council member and executive at the time went up there with a full group of people, blew the hinges off the gate, and then drug it down the road away from it. And then the next day there was another gate back up there. Just to kind of show, I don't know who keeps giving people in King County explosives, but whoever it is, stop, please, because somebody's going to eventually get hurt. So finally at this point in time, King County is like, okay, let's try the courts. So King County goes in on the whole premise of like, this is our land, we own the rights to get up there, like what the heck? And Tacoma comes in and says, well, we need clean water for the city, and we've been there a lot longer than your road. Back and forth, bunch of whole judicial stuff, and Tacoma wins. At this point in time, King County mounts another challenge. They lose. Well, kind of the final nail in the coffin, if you will, was in 1967. Northern Pacific was kind of going through its dying stages of kind of selling off assets in one of the here and there. Well, Leicester is one of those assets. And while the residents of Leicester had continued to fight over the years, the land that they lived on was not owned by them. It was owned by Northern Pacific. So for the whopping price of $37,000, which is $357,000 today, Northern Pacific sold the land to Tacoma Power. Now, at this point in time, Tacoma, trying to act in good faith, if you will, said, we'll give everybody that lives in here a lifetime lease, but at the end of your lease, get out. A lot of people at that point in time were just like, my asset's worthless, screw this, I'm out of here. So they sold it to Tacoma, undervalued, of course, but Lester was effectively dead. The last person to live up there was by the name of Gertrude Murphy. I believe she passed in the early 2000s. Her house is actually still up there, which is kind of freaky when you're driving through the woods, and then there's suddenly this white house that's on the side of the road, and you're just like, where did that come from? However, the river always wins. Geology always wins. Everything that we build is temporary, which is kind of not humbling to think about in our little tiny human minds, and everything always comes back to geology. Because when we look at a geologic map of the area, as with everything in this area, it is complicated. Very, very complicated as a whole. So I'm going to give you a 30,000 foot view just on this. So we've got a couple different things moving and grooving here. This kind of purplish, kind of looked pink to me earlier, but kind of looks purple now. All of that is volcanic material, Cascade story. So 35 million years and younger. Back over on this side here, you can't really, I guess you can, but this kind of greenish material right here, that's our coal story here in the Black Diamond area. So that sandstone that we all know and love and we see in the gorge. This kind of, I don't want to call it tan, so on and so forth. That's that glacier story that we were talking about. That is all sorts of glacial till and kind of gravels that have come in through the time. If you're a farmer or a gardener in this area, you know that digging in the clays here are a pain in the knee. They're not easy to build. But you'll notice that Howard Hanson sits right on top of that glacial material. That glacial material was so much that it was able to kind of overcome those smaller layers. But when we zoom in on Howard Hanson, which is where my nice little Microsoft Paint red splotch is, you'll notice that two sides of that area are kind of smushed right in between that volcanic story. That photo I showed you earlier of where Northern Pacific's kind of hole in the ground was is actually right there. So just to point out, that railroad literally used to run right through there. So they had definitely had to condemn it. But the reason I show you that is because right up on this side here, you'll notice this little arrow here. On geologic maps, that indicates landslide. So Howard Hanson is effectively built on the side of an ancient landslide, a 10,000-year-old landslide. Once again, proving that people in this area don't know where to build things properly, same as the folks down in Auburn. The other part about this, and some of you may not actually be aware of this, but did you know that you have multiple faults in your backyard? And not small faults. I mean, we're talking faults like, for example, here, the White River Fault that's down in this area that is thought to go from the Tacoma Fault structure all the way over to eastern Washington. There's also two major faults that are just to the immediate north of it that may join with the Seattle Fault. They may join with the White River Fault. It's an understudied area. We don't know that part of the story. But what I find interesting is that it's been known since at least 1999 that this might be a problem. And the fact that also, because of that glacial story, there's a lot of water that's stuck kind of in that ground, if you will. Now, one of my kind of earliest snap to memory judgments was roughly in the early 2000s when everybody in this area seemed to get a little postcard that said that Howard Hanson could potentially flood. In fact, when I moved into my house in Auburn 5 years ago, that was one of the first things that we got from the county. We didn't get a congratulations on your new house. We got a, you live in a flood zone house. And it was to the point, actually, that we even made the national news about it. It's not something that you should be proud of, but hey, once again, that's where the railroad was, right there. A little bit more of a happy sense there. But in 2006, multiple places flooded out in this area. A lot of the northern parts of Mount Rainier, Ipswich Creek along the Carbon River, reason you can't drive out there anymore. A lot of the west side roads in Mount Rainier, too, are guilty of this. Howard Hanson was no different. It's because of that ancient effluvian story and that landslide story that some chaos started to happen, if you will. So that landslide that we talked about is over here on the right-hand side. And the thing when you're building a dam is you have to dig all the way down to bedrock, as we saw with the Mud Mountain Dam. And as you dig, you got to get down to that bedrock. And from there, then you have to put grout into all of the cracks. Every single crack you find, you have to stick grout in there because you don't want a leaky dam. The Teton Dam, for example, over in Idaho is a perfect example of what happens when you don't grout things right. That dam is no longer there anymore because they didn't grout things right at their bedrock. So Howard Hanson, that's the reason why they were so concerned about it, because over here on the landslide part of things, they had put grout down. They had done basically what you were supposed to do, but because of that landslide and because of that permeability, because of that glacial story, there wasn't enough grout basically. So they had to basically cut a whole new line in the dam, grout it all the way down, costing a lot of money and giving residents in the area a huge concern for many years. In fact, a lot of years actually. And it's interesting too, because it wasn't just a lot of dams seem to have issues at that time. It wasn't just Howard Hanson. I have distinct memories of also the Lake Taps Dam having issues. I remember, I believe it's not Lake Sawyer, Lake Young's having issues too. My next door neighbor growing up, actually, she worked for the city of Covington, and I remember my mom telling me one time that if she ever calls us and says go, don't question it. Which, as a young kid, not really thinking about that, and now being an adult, just going, ooh, that wouldn't have been fun. And especially living along Highway 18, those nice little noise barriers, that would have created a bad situation. But also down in Kent, they had that same kind of concern, if you will. Down along the valley there, they had these lovely sandbags that were there for easily 10 years, a long time. I remember them very specifically, but that just goes to show that no matter how you square it, the river will always win. Our structures are temporary, and while Howard Hanson still stands today, you know, the structure as a whole, it's nothing to look at. But when we think about how this spillway right here can handle upwards of 107,000 cubic feet of water, or 660,000 a second, 1,000 gallons a second, I want to put that number in perspective, that is one Olympic-sized swimming pool every single second. If it's hitting that spillway, that is every single second that will be coming down into this valley. So Howard Hanson might not be pretty, and it has a really long story. I'd like to thank Howard Hanson Dam for doing its job. So with that brings us to the end of the 2024 presentation season. The next thing coming up, if you will, of course, is Hometown Christmas. This is a free event, great for children, families, everything, if you will. There are a few friendly faces that I've seen here several times. There's also some new folks coming up here too, so I feel it's only right that we give you guys a little bit of a hint of what's coming up next year, presentation-wise. Now, this is confirmed stuff at this point in time. We don't have dates yet, but we're going to talk about everything from the mercury mines of the Green River Gorge to Mount Rainier to, we're going to go a little bit into the glacier story. We're going to talk about Franklin. We're going to talk about Wolf Bower, the savior of the gorge. We're going to have presentations for children involving geology stuff. We're going to have several guest presenters coming up. There's going to be a lot to come in 2025. And from me, who's had the opportunity to present to you guys so many times through 2024, all that's left is to say thank you. Here's till next year. I'm just going to stop rubbing on my beard. Sherry is indicating that I need to pull something.
Do you guys have questions before we do a ticket drawing? Go ahead.
How do you get up to Leicester? Can you get up to Leicester?
You have to go over Stampede Pass. Oh, you do it. Yeah, you have to go up and over Stampede Pass, and I believe it's about a 2-mile hike out there. However, the one time that I went out there, somebody from Tacoma Power kind of accosted me a little bit, and they were like, "What are you doing out here?" I'm like, "I'm on public land. What are you going to do about it?" I was very rude to him, if you will, but he was rude to me. So you can still get to Leicester. The buildings that were there have been unfortunately torn down as Tacoma has kind of tried to prevent people from going out there, if you will. Don't believe that you can fish, and you have to have a special permit for, I think it's GMU 360 to go out there and special hunt, but there's plenty of stuff to hike and all that stuff. You can actually, from Leicester, you can actually then make a left-hand turn and go up towards Tacoma Pass, and if you take Corral Pass up and over the top of it, you can drop back down into Greenwater and come back down along 410. So it's kind of a nice, fun round trip, if you will, and really great views of Mount Rainier up there. Excellent views of Mount Rainier. I would recommend going to Kelly Butte instead.
Good question. Other questions? How many of you actually live in Black Diamond? Raise your hand if you live here. Look at that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of you. How many of you had family that were born here in Black Diamond? How many of you were born in Black Diamond? Jerry, you're the only one.
Me.
We're pleased to have you here today. It's always great to have our hometown people come back, but to all of you, very much welcome. It's just great. We've been continuing to grow. This year will mark the second year in a row that we're going to be over 6,000 visitors to this museum, so it's really fun. Anyway, would you like to draw a ticket, sir?
We've doubled the
got a
population
little
of Black
get-together
Diamond in
people.
1886.
Okay, I said it was a surprise, but some of you may know already what it is. I'm just going to read the last three numbers if this is on your ticket. Are you ready? 3, 5, 9. Oh, you drew your own ticket. All right.
You had that in your hand.
We have a minor memory book for you. Slip it right in there, did he? That's okay. We welcome you visitors. So
Perfect.
the museum's open yet for a while, and we have 2 complete floors. And I'm so honored to have Jerry Darby. I still call you Jerry Darby, right?
I do too.
Yeah, you did too here today, because I grew up with Brother Jack, and we went to school together. I will tell a little story though. Jack and I have a long history, and there were 2 girls in my class and 10 boys. It was very small back then, but we always played baseball in the field. Jack was a pitcher. Twice, my nose got broken. So one day in Mr. Hubbard's class, after I came back from the second broken nose, I took my pencil and I stabbed him in the arm.
Oh.
I was the first girl Mr. Hubbard ever swatted.
Can't
My
imagine
mom
why.
said, I usually give dictionary work, but the boys get a swat, and my mom said, give her both. So
I'll remind Jack.
that's
of
my
that
story with Jack. I think I haven't seen him for years and years, but I think he tells me he still got the piece of
And you lived through it.
Oh, if you grew up in Black Diamond, you lived through way worse than that. So. But thank you all for coming. We really
Lead broke off
appreciate
in
it.
his arm? The lead?
I think the lead piece is still there somewhere. I haven't seen it for, I don't know.